Welcome to October, the spookiest month, when everyone participates in the ritual of raising awareness for cybersecurity, which means this week we speak with Jim Manico from Manico Security about digital identity and authentication that isn't awful. In the news segment, it's a horde of zombie flaws from IoT to old AV, a puzzle box of vuln disclosure pain, Eldritch XSS, and more. Check over your shoulder and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/Synopsys to learn more. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 125, Dead Alive, recorded October 12th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Happy Monday. I'm a professional day. Oh, no, it's Columbus or Indigenous Peoples Day. Depends on which holiday you celebrate.
Indeed it is. Let's find out if we have a professional here in John Kinsella.
I'm completely not a professional. I'm just here for the laughs and the InfoSec.
That's why we like to have you around. Oh, and we also like to have around our listeners, which if you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows, then submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. In our October 22nd technical training, we will provide a first look at a new free resource that delivers thousands of remedies as a service to bridge the gap between vulnerabilities found and vulnerabilities fixed. On October 28th, learn how to build an integrated security platform in our webcast at 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts. Jim Manico is the founder of Manico Security, where he trains software developers on secure coding and security engineering. He is also an investor advisor for BitDiscovery, Nucleus Security, Secure Circle, CESPA, and Signal Sciences. Jim is a frequent speaker on secure software practices, is a member of the Java Champion community, and is the author of Ironclad Java, Building Secure Web Applications from Oracle Press. Jim also volunteers for the OWASP Foundation as a project co-lead for the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard and the OWASP Proactive Controls. Hello, Jim. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, Johnny. How are you doing today, good sir?
We're happy to have you here because we're talking about identity today, digital identity, that is, and often how we prove identity, which tends to be passwords, but people not only need to choose passwords, but developers need to build systems that accept proper passwords, let's say. So if we start with that, with the idea of digital identity, maybe I should just roll that back a second and say, where should we start with digital identity and passwords?
I think we should start by calling people by their correct name, Mike. Your video is labeled Johnny, but I know that that's not actually your name. Let's start by calling you by the right name. But I think when it comes to passwords, which is the foundation of authentication, like it or not, passwords are the foundation of modern authentication. And a lot of people have instinct about what good passwords should be, but I don't like instinct. I like standards. And this is where, all right, NIST Special Publication 863, the digital identity standard that came out about 2 weeks ago, authored by Jim Fenton primarily, really helps drive and change all of our assumptions about modern password policy. So that's where I go when looking at that topic these days, good sir.
Absolutely, and it's not only -63, it's A, B, and C. So they roll out a bunch of great aspects to this. And one of my favorites is that let's talk about just maybe passwords themselves and perhaps maybe some threat modeling as well, because it's October, as I like to remind our listeners, which also means we're getting around a quarter for the year. So maybe it's time for quarterly password rotation, which seems one of the scariest, most horror-filled things ever.
Why? That's the first question I want to ask anyone who thinks that regular password rotation, that means forcing a user to provide a new password every 90 days. This is a common enterprise policy. My first question is, why are you doing this? What risk are you worried about? Can I ask you that, Mike? Like, what's the main risk that requires us to reset a password every 90 days?
Oh, I know why. Can I?
Ooh, all right. Okay, come on in, Matt.
Because we use the same password over and over again. So if I force somebody to change it, maybe I can stop using the same password for everything.
Well, that's a different attack type. You're talking about an attack called credential stuffing. And that particular risk, the risk of a user reusing a password and a username across multiple systems and having one of those username passwords being part of a public breach. Now, and then having an attacker use that published credential to break into your system now, or break into that user's account. The whole issue is we should be stopping credential stuffing when a user first registers and when a user changes their password and when a major breach happens. Those are the policy protection points, in my opinion. So when a user is trying to change their password, we look up that username and password in public breach data sets to make sure it's not exposed. When a user registers, we should do the same thing. And I'm not just talking about common passwords. I'm talking about a username password pair that's known in the wild in some way. And also when there's a major breach, like say Gmail's passwords get breached, we should be looking up for an account match and force those users to do password reset immediately. Again, this attack type is called credential stuffing. It's new. NIST 800-63 does talk about it, and the changing passwords every 90 days is not the proper control to deal with that problem, good sir. So what else? Why should we change our password every 90 days? Credential stuffing is not a fair answer, in my opinion.
Because our company told us to.
That's right. and what Jim is getting at here, you're making that strong case. It's kind of hard to argue with a little bit better data or a little bit better threat model that just says, what if we actually only did change the password when we believe it was compromised or we suspect it was compromised?
Yes.
But you're also getting into credential stuffing and trying to defeat it. So we also can't just defeat somebody with a dictionary repeatedly trying to hammer an API. Which also then, one of the things it might bring us to think about are multi-factor authentication. So one of the horrors that I have is that I've been told by a theme among the security community that SMS is dead and I should never use this as my second factor because that seems pretty scary, but I want to have a second factor.
So as a professional, I've always made a gut check about when I think multi-factor is needed. And I don't want to do that anymore. I like experience. I know we all have security experience, but I want to rely less on my experience and rely more on data and standards written by other experts. So let's talk about this. So NIST at 863, they have a workflow in the standard which describes different risk factors for your authenticator and how strong the authenticator should be based on the risk affecting your software. For example, and there's 3 different levels, AAL level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 is essentially, I'm going to do passwords by themselves with a username. Level 2 is, I'm going to do some form of multi-factor, and that number must be cryptographically generated, cryptographically random, but it's not a real like crypto authenticator. I'm not doing like digital signature verification. Level 3, AAL level 3, that's basically FIDO, where I need a smart card or a YubiKey, where I'm doing a real cryptographic exchange. Now, when do we use each levels? Now, here's a summary of what NIST is saying. At level 1, passwords are only acceptable for public data. Like if I have like a bunch of scientific papers that are for the public, but you have to have an account to download them, I'm not protecting sensitive data, so a password by itself is acceptable, and that's it. The moment we have sensitive data, NIST workflows say you should be doing multi-factor, some form of multi-factor. And then at level 3, when we have like personal safety in jeopardy and other risk factors become more severe, then we should be doing some kind of FIDO, smart card, actual cryptographic exchange. And I'm summarizing this quickly. The point I'm trying to make, Mike, and everyone else, is that I don't want to just guess at how strong my authenticator should be. I want to use a real standard to clearly define that threat model. And the first time I've ever seen this is in Special Publication 863. Yeah. And I think we should all be reading it if we haven't done so already around these topics. There's my answer.
Jim, your point, though, I think is pretty well known. We've been saying this for a long time. Multi-factor authentication. I mean, any sensitive data, and we know that businesses have some level of sensitive data. Multi-factor authentication is like the baseline, but yet look at its adoption rates. Look at how many systems are not protected with multi-factor authentication. Look at how many systems are being breached that a multi-factor authenticator would have stopped those breaches from occurring. It's great to have it in a standard. How the heck do we get people to actually implement this thing?
Yeah.
Well, again, I'm primarily an educator, and I get asked about this question like many times a week. And so the reason I think Special Publication, NIST 800-63 is so important is because I'm not just telling a story based on my experience or based on recommendations that everybody in the security industry provides. I now have real measurable risk factors and a real standard and real workflow diagrams to make these choices. So when I'm working with a company, again, I'm not just guessing, I'm whipping out the standard and not making a conclusion. I'm walking through measuring the risk factors, letting them make determination. Is public safety at play? Is sensitive data at play? Is reputation, financial damage, all these different risk factors. And now we've measured them. Now we can go through the workflow to say, all right, here's that work factor. Oh, you're at level 3. Personal safety is in jeopardy because of your software. You're at level 3. Or this is only public data. You can get away with just a password for this system. Yes. So, and I think that's the point. Whenever sensitive data is in play, I always want to push multi-factor. I always do. But I want to do it with the standard as my sword and shield here, and it's a much more powerful message. And how do you convince companies to do it? Look at Amazon. They do some pretty deep risk management. They offer multi-factor, but they don't force it. I think that's a common solution for a lot of the e-tailers out there. If you're a bank, you're always going to have multi-factor. And so even though everyone is not following the standard and many people critique SMS, hey, I think SMS is fantastic compared to passwords alone. I'd much rather you move to SMS as an interstitial step to a stronger multi-factor than not do it at all. It's a great first step with multi-factor. I digress. NIST 800-63, it's a real standard, workflow, threat model, risk calculation, so you could make a professional standard decision about how strong your authenticator should be. And of course, use multi-factor. I'm with you.
Well, and I think so. One of the aspects there is that as an enterprise, especially moving to call it a Beyond Corp, a zero trust model, those types of things, it's a lot easier to mandate for employees to use. Here is an SSH key based. Here's your PKI for certificate management for your employees, so you can have a cert and even a second factor that can be FIDO because you can provision those with laptops. But we start to get into the consumer space that most people, in fact, do have a cell phone that can handle SMS. So therefore, you can have a token that everyone has on SendApp. But there's still, to Matt's point, an adoption issue. So how have you seen smart or clever approaches to either increase adoption or working with companies to figure out at what point should we say, here is a step-up auth or a step-up point that we're going to require that says, we're not going to belabor the point about multi-factor authentication just to go through these particular workflows. But once you get into this area where you're transferring money, or maybe transferring money over a certain threshold, or you're resetting a password, that's where we do need to have better confidence in that particular workflow. Not necessarily because it's particularly extraditive sensitive data, but it's also a particularly sensitive action as well.
Mike, I think when it comes to multi-factor for enterprise logins, I don't have to convince anyone. Most every enterprise I work with, for their corporate login, they have some kind of multi-factor already.
Right.
So that's not really a debate I have to have. Where my world is mostly web application development, where people are building e-commerce sites, banking sites, enterprise sites for their own company, and social media sites, you name it. And the zero trust model in that world is not really realistic, right? I don't have the ability to store a cryptographic key for a client, for a web user, not in a realistic, scalable way. In fact, Mike, I have no way to even store a secret in a browser. I really don't. There's no good way to do it. So when it comes to web application development, it's a different world for me. And imagine you're an e-tailer and you have a good business, and now you want to turn on multi-factor, and some security guy convinces you to force everyone to use it. And all of a sudden, my commerce went down by 60%. Whoa, you just lost money because you put a control on. This is why a lot of the e-tailers will leave it on as an option, but I don't know any e-tailer that forces it upon you. So these decisions are even more complicated and more difficult than the best standards out there around multi-factor. And again, the zero, you mentioned a lot about zero trust models. This is not my world. That's enterprise networking. That kind of next generation thinking does not work at all in the world of web standards and web tech that I want to deliver in a scalable way to consumers. So depending on your audience, right? Are you on an enterprise network? Are you doing web-based computing? Are you purely a mobile app? Oh, I can suddenly store cryptographic secrets again and do higher forms of authentication in a mobile app, maybe in iOS, most Android. So it really depends on your architecture and what you're trying to solve to really make proper authenticator decisions. And I personally, things like in the world of like consumer-driven web security, I keep away from knowledge-based authentication. I keep away from the non-password mechanisms out there. I keep away from the zero trust models and focus more on web security standards. And I think the most progressive direction in web security standards is FIDO and using things like YubiKey Smart Card integrated with web tech. That's the direction web tech is going in, and that's what I have my eye on when it comes to authenticator strength. And that's AAL level 3 when it comes to the NIST standards.
And so that's what's neat, because one of the choices you can make as a web developer, web application owner, is to say, we're going to try to do something with FIDO, with WebAuthn, and take advantage of what the modern browsers now do support as that standard. Or you can also say, what if we just don't deal with passwords at all and do something like a login with Google or login with one of the other identity providers and rely on something like OAuth or JOT. When developers start to think about that direction, are there cautions you throw out, or are there things that you encourage should they have those decisions?
That's a great question. First of all, when we're using like a Google, LinkedIn login or Facebook login, the standard that drives that is primarily OpenID Connect, right? That's the main standard of the day to allow a federated authentication. And by the way, if you look at NIST 800-63, they talk about federation levels of strength and how strong your federation tech should be. So if you're going to open up OIDC to other, or if you're going to utilize OIDC or open up an authorization endpoint for OAuth, there's standards that drive how strong that should be in a high level, but still helpful. So I digress. What are some of the problems as developers shift from like traditional session login models to next generation like OAuth and OIDC? Well, it's a mess, Mike. There are a lot of standards. Again, if I'm going to let federation happen, if I'm going to let Google login allow a user to log into my site, I'm going to use OpenID Connect. It's a well solidified standard. There are a lot of great libraries to drive this. You got to deal with key management you have no, once you're doing OIDC, intra-server work primarily, you got keys involved and key storage. It's complicated, but it's a solved issue, I would say. Now, what about OAuth? OAuth 2 is another standard. It's not really for authentication, Mike. It's for delegation. It's like Mint. If you're Mint and you want to now collect everybody's banking information, like banking balances and similar, I don't want to give Mint the password to my bank account. So I'll use the OAuth authorization code flow. So I'm not leaking my credentials. And then you're not handing me as a user a high-powered token in my client. You're handing Mint a high-powered token, so Mint can ask for my balance only on my behalf. That's the proper use of OAuth. It's a delegation authorization standard. It's not meant for access control, though. It's not meant for login. It's not meant to replace authentication. It's meant for delegation, to let a machine act on my behalf when I'm not logged in a limited way for my primary account, like a valet key. So one of the other flows that's common in OAuth is the native AuthZ code flow. This is for mobile apps or native. So in a mobile app, I'll start by hitting the login button. That'll usually go to a browser and be redirected to the login page with an authorization code in it. I'm going to log in, and that authorization code flows from the browser. I log in through the browser. Am I going to let the mobile app do some stuff for my account? Then that authorization code flows back to the native app, who then uses the authorization code to request a real refresh and access token. This is why your mobile app is often logged in forever, because the mobile app, through this three-legged hop, is given a token that is alive forever. But then you can then log into the account to revoke it. But very often, because of the native AuthZ code flow for OAuth, to delegate a limited amount of my account to a mobile app, so I can use a mobile app that's then revocable through the browser, through the actual website. This is a very complicated flow used in native, used intra websites, and used in background scripts and similar to handle this delegation. Again, I want to give a machine access to a subset of my account, which it can operate even when I'm not logged in, without exposing credentials to these services. This is what OAuth is all about. And by the way, Mike, I think it's one of the most misused protocols. If you're using OAuth for access control, if you're using OAuth for, say, purely for authentication, you're misusing this framework. And it's a commonly misused framework. And why am I going into all this, Mike? I'm just trying to illustrate that the simple identity problem that years ago was login and session management is now a combination of federation needs like SAML and OIDC, delegation needs that OAuth 2 solves, and a multi-device environment that I really didn't have to deal with even a couple of years ago. So it's if identity was a Facebook relationship status today, Mike, Mr. Shima, it's complicated.
It's complicated. And I think so. Some of the underlying themes you were really hitting on there is that, especially with the OIDC, yes, it's introducing a lot of key management, but a lot of that key management is actually on the backend server, and that's where developers actually have a lot more control, rather than just relying on, oh, please, dear consumer, please choose a strong password, please opt in to the multi-factor we support, and that you have a lot less influence or potentially control over. So that seems like a great aspect too. And even with OAuth, you're pointing out some great aspects of it that, at the very least, is still dealing with managing around tokens as opposed to sharing passwords. So at least OAuth is pulling us away from there. So it's going in a good direction, but it sounds like OIDC bringing as many secrets onto the back end and server-to-server trust and negotiation of, hey, this person has a token, should we trust them? Hey, should I trust them? Tell me so. That seems like that's what you're really advocating for, is a really positive model that we can have strong security around.
Think of it this way: tokens have replaced session management. I'm no longer keeping a in-memory or tracking area memory for a user. We're no longer doing traditional session management. That's an area of memory on the server and a session ID on the client. We're now using digital signatures and tokens in crypto to maintain that session in a very stateless way. But the point of this is, Mike, authentication has not changed that much. Even though I might be using Google as an OpenID Connect provider, I'm still logging into Google with the password. And even though I might be using OAuth 2 to drive the AuthZ native code flow to my mobile app to keep it logged in and to manage that through the web login, hey, I'm still doing the initial delegation handshake to grant my mobile device permission to access these resource servers. That initial hit is still a password to let me originally log in. So I want to think, I'm really thinking of it this way. Authentication, username, password, multi-factor, yeah, there's FIDO and there's all these challenges, but it's not changed much. Passwords still rule when it comes to authentication. Now, what's changed behind the scenes after you authenticate is session management. Now, that's radically different. That's now tokens. It's now all of identity has basically been reduced to digital signatures. Because this thing you're talking about, the JSON Web Token, JWT, the JOT, I don't have to manage a session anymore. I now just, at login, hand the user basically this JSON Web Token in some way, either raw or through OpenID Connect or through an OAuth 2, JWT inside of one of their tokens, whatever. But this JSON Web Token has all the claims about a user, the username, how long they're logged into, how long they're logged in for, if you want, even their access control levels. And then it's digitally signed by a key on the verification. Then it's digitally signed by a key. And then this token is given to another server or to a user or to a device. Then they give me that, they give us that token back. There's no tracking of this token. How do we know it's still valid? Well, we check the digital signature with another key. Is it still valid? If it's valid, then we grab the contents of that token, the username, access control levels, the timestamp, this token is no longer valid, and assume it's true with usually minor validation. So what the debate about authentication is still raging. Passwords rule the day. I don't see any major movement away from passwords. No way. But the behind the scenes session management, as we move into microservices, I'm now hitting like 100 different services as opposed to one server. In that world, session management falls apart. So we've moved to stateless tokens to replace session management to achieve scalability and to maintain authentication even deep through several hops and several services without needing to check a central store. So we can do this session management in a hyper scalable way across many different services using digital signature cryptography. That's the modern era that's replaced session management, Mike.
And go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, I mean, you made a statement that some analysts would probably say, but no, passwordless is coming, right? I mean, passwordless is a thing, right?
I have completely dismissed passwordless security as something that's largely not worth studying right now. I just don't. I don't want to recommend non-standard authentication to my customers. I have to make recommendations that they're going to act on in some way. So I don't feel comfortable recommending knowledge-based authentication, passwordless authentication, and similar for anything that's not public data. If you're just shilling public data, do whatever you want. Any kind of single-factor authentication is fine. Go for it. But once you get into sensitive data, financial data, anything that's PII or similar, I want to use tried and true authentication mechanisms, username, password, a progressive password policy using special publication 863, a progressive password policy, and some form of standard multi-factor. These are recommendations I stand by and feel comfortable with. Recommending passwordless authentication for all but public data, I'm not ready to make that call yet. And if you are, I'd love to hear more about it. I'm always willing to learn more.
No, it's just the buzz, right? I mean, people are talking about, the future is passwordless. But what you just said is, no, it's not tried and true. It's not standardized. There's no standard behind it. Why would I recommend passwordless? But a lot of people think passwordless is the next iteration of this.
Yeah, if you want to protect your public data with it, go for it. Otherwise, I'm going to wait for the technology to mature more. And again, I'm boring. I'm an educator, right? Anything that is a modern, exciting topic, I'm never going to talk about it because that's not education. That's more like cutting edge, bleeding edge research type stuff. So I'm waiting for technologies to be solidified and have best practices and standards around them so I can then recommend them and how to use them securely. Bleeding edge type stuff, I don't have data on that yet. I don't have good studies on it yet. I don't have standards on it yet. I don't have experience with it yet. So I wouldn't recommend it. But I guess it's exciting. It makes things easier on the user, I guess. But I'm not ready to recommend it.
Well, and especially there's of things that haven't gone away. Passwords, as we've been talking about so far. Also want to bring in a different angle from the threat modeling approach here to also think account recovery, because we can have all kinds of fantastic multi-factor auth, delegation, federation, but if the account recovery becomes impossible, I lost my FIDO key and or I've completely forgotten my password, and then I can just call in to customer support and have them reset to my email. Obviously, we've introduced a pretty weak link there into this particular workflow. So what have you seen about account recovery that is working better, or the cautions that you throw out for the companies, the organizations you're working with?
One of the reasons why NIST is suggesting that only public data can have single password authenticator is because in order to do secure password recovery, I got to have multi-factor. I have to. If there is not multi-factor in play, there is not a strong, secure way to do account recovery. So what this means is when I'm calling into a call center or I'm going through the password reset process, I don't have my password, I lost it, or my password manager got borked, whatever. In that process of asking me questions, who are you? What's your account number? What's your social security number? I'm usually going to be challenged with that multi-factor value. I still have my phone or my multi-factor device, so I can still do the multi-factor challenge as part of the password recovery process. And this is what the banks are doing. This is what strong password recovery looks like. And you can even see one of the OAuth cheat sheets that's been well maintained over the years. The OAuth forgot password cheat sheet is a good reference to look at this workflow. But again, my conjecture is if you're password only, I'm going to send you an email reset link and ask you security questions that I can look up on your Facebook account. You can quote me on this, Mike. If you're doing password only single factor authentication, you can't do secure password recovery. It's not possible.
So speaking of passwords, and this might just be academic, but one of our listeners asked a question around what about biometrics? I mean, you talked about some of the other aspects here, the KBA and things like that, but where do you think to use an example, a thumbprint fits into this, or a retinal scan? Would you consider that just a tiny implementation detail, or is that more grounded around some of these proposals?
I do not consider biometrics to be a credential. So this is my take on this. Anything that's biometric centric, at least today in today's state of the art, no biometric is a credential. You cannot biometrics are usernames. So if I can skip the username and do a thumbprint, but still password multi-factor challenge. So that's how I like to implement biometrics. And not everyone, like my iPhone, right? A lot of the default, the iPhone's changed a lot with biometrics. This is the first mass rollout of biometrics to the consumer audience to the tune of many millions, right? How has that stood up to security statistically? And so I don't have a good answer. That's where I would look. How has the iPhone biometric authentication method stood up to security in real world scenarios? But in most of my recommendations in my courseware, I recommend that companies treat biometrics like a username and still have, based on what level of authenticator that your risk model is showing, your threat model is showing, also do a password and multi-factor of some level in addition to biometrics is my take on the subject.
Yep. So why I brought this up to you, I thought this would be interesting, is for folks who might not understand that, at least in most cases, the thumbprint isn't actually the password, right? So I thought that might be interesting to talk about. And I think we went through this a little bit when we talk about JWT and some of those type of things. But it might be worth spending 30 seconds just talking through what happens when someone actually does, the retinal scan or the thumbprint. You mentioned iPhone. So if you're familiar, that might be an example that people could relate to if you know how that goes through.
I'm not sure the question, but my concern here is that if I set a thumbprint in a website and that website is breached, which that happens, right? Website breaches happen. Now my thumbprint is exposed forever. I can't you just talked about forgot password and resetting a credential. If you're using biometrics for a credential and that's exposed, it's exposed forever. You can't reset that. Well, the iPhone is using biometrics, your facial scan, or they had thumbprint for a previous generation. So the iPhone has has experimented with multiple generations of biometrics, what I believe is to relative success, right? I don't allow my phone to unlock with biometrics. I've turned that off. Like, I have a significant numeric code, which if you grab my phone, you can see my thumbprints on what digits I'm using. So, I'm not bullish on biometrics at all. I've disabled it on my phone as an easy way to unlock my phone, and I don't depend on it because I know biometrics tends to be public data. That's my take on it.
There go a whole bunch of security startups. You just blew the entire funding thesis for the rest of their life.
That's okay. They're startups experimenting with new technology. That's great. And some of them are going to succeed, and some of them are going to fail. Some of them are going to offer strong solutions, and some of them are going to be charlatans, or maybe not charlatans, but some of them are not going to offer strong solutions. And the market will suss this out. We'll critique and comment in subjective and objective ways. We'll try it out. We'll plot, and then the strongest will survive. So that's the thing, is that I'm willing to change my mind in a heartbeat if you show me good standards and good data and real world data that this stuff does provide good authentication security. So I applaud the startups trying to make authentication easier. The status quo today of username, password manager, and multi-factor challenge, this is hard on users. And so if we come up with something that still provides good authentication security and eases the burden on users, I love that. In fact, NIST Special Publication 800-63, that's standard. It's all about making password verification easier on the user and to put that burden on the authenticator server side. So what you're asking for around passwordless security, you're asking for easier authentication, and that's the direction of NIST Special Publication 800-63. That's the direction of that as well around modern password policy. Make it easier on the user and put the burden of getting this right on the authenticator themselves.
I think, and that's for me, that's where my favoritism comes towards WebAuthn, and seeing some company like Apple combine the biometrics for the local identity assertion to the device, combined with that secure enclave where you have your cryptographic material that should be extremely difficult to extract, that can now confirm that, yep, it looks like this person who said this is who they were. We're going to assert that we believe it. Here's some crypto foo to prove it, and we're just going to start signing a lot of this communication, these tokens, as you're describing, in between the client and the server. So hopefully that, I think, is what really I see is getting us towards a, perhaps not passwordless, but a password low friction. I'm trying to think of the better marketing term here. But basically, when we don't realize that we have passwords, we just have a nice cryptographic identity dropped into a secure enclave that's hard to extract, and we get to authenticate to lots of different applications that way.
When you control the ecosystem like Apple does, or if you control the ecosystem on your enterprise network and similar, then I'm with you. These next generation zero trust type of cryptographic authentication for web apps and similar is way more viable for internet type stuff and for a closed ecosystem. Absolutely. For public web standards, this is my main job as an educator. I mostly teach web developers doing consumer facing stuff. We're going to be the last to get this. We're going to be the last because it's a least controlled environment, and we're trying to support a plethora of browsers that do and do not support some of the modern web crypto standards. So those of us out there in web consumer land, we're going to be the last to get this, Mike. But if you're in a closed ecosystem like Apple, Enterprise Network, and similar, way more viable to push ahead with these kind of standards.
Well, speaking of pushing ahead, Jim, you are quite prolific in the type of training you provided, presentations. Where can people find out more beyond just digital identity that you're passionate about? I know there's got to be at least one or two other topics.
Absolutely. If you just want to get some free information, I'd recommend reading the ASVS standard. I'm one of the co-authors of it with Andrew Vanderstock, Daniel Cuthbert, Josh Grossman, awesome professionals. I'd read the OAuth cheat sheet series as well, and just go to YouTube and type in my name, Jim Manico, and there's a lot of free hour to 2 hour presentations on application security, right? Commercially, if you're looking for paid training, I'm at manico.com, MANICODE.com, and you can reach me over email. JIM single quote one single quote does not equal single quote at manico.com. That's a SQL injection payload, so don't use it. Let's try Jim at manico.com. And again, I'm always happy to help you out for free as well. If you just need some guidance, I'll point in the right direction of what you should be reading in application security as well. And watch this podcast too.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. Thanks once again. Also want to thank Matt and want to thank John for joining us. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.